Today I want to talk about the microplastics. So the problem is that the scientists that made our first plastics got the task of making plastics that could last forever, non-biodegradable. And they managed, partly by selecting certain molecules and partly by putting poisons in the plastic. So we have non-biodegradable plastics. The problem is not that it comes from fossil fuel, the problem is that there's nothing that eats it. And that means it will end up in our food chain and inside us. So where does it come from? There are several sources from where we get this microplastic. The one that is talked about the most is microplastics from the ocean, but that's not the only source. The problem is that for the first time in human history, around 15 years ago, so it's very new, plastic from our garbage dumps started floating out into the ocean, and the problem is that it doesn't sink. Garbage that is non-biodegradable we have had for ages. Stone, cement, steel. If that falls into the ocean, it sinks. Plastics doesn't, and it gets broken into smaller and smaller pieces by the sun and by the waves and by fish chewing on it and swallowing it. So that gets into our food chain, and you shouldn't think that it's only fish. If you live in any of the Western countries, the chicken you eat, the beef you eat, and the pork you eat, those animals it comes from have been fed ground up fish from the ocean, including the microplastics. So it's everywhere. Floating, non-biodegradable, breaking down into small pieces. So that's one problem. The second problem is our clothes. It became very popular in the 1950s with nylon stockings, and then it spread to all types of clothes, and nylon and all the different type of plastics replaced cotton and wool and hemp and other things that we made clothes of in those days. These days it's rare to have wool in clothes, so what is left is cotton and plastics. And that turns into microplastics in our washing machines. And that's a problem for the city drinking water in most of the big cities around the world. Drinking water for your city comes from a non-clean source. There are very few places that have water in volumes out in nature that is drinkable as it is, and it has to be cleaned. And what the city fathers have figured out around the world is that it's cheaper to extra clean the sewage water that has to be cleaned anyway than to clean the river water. So in very many cities, part of what you're drinking used to be the sewage 2 days before. Recirculation of water. And yes, they're filtering out the biggest microplastic, but not the smallest one. We do not have a mechanism that can filter out microplastics from water for the smallest dimensions of it. So when you turn the tap, you get microplastics in the water. For this, there is luckily a solution. You can buy a non-industrial scale, a home scale filter. I don't think buying bottled water helps. That is not filtered. That would have needed industrial scale filtering. So bottled water is worse than home filtered water. The third source is our tires. Some smart person figured out that rubber tires for cars last longer if you mix them with a decent amount of plastic. That is now in the air we breathe. So this is a very serious problem. There's a lot of microplastics just from what we consume, from what we eat. The latest study shows it's around 5 grams per week of microplastics that a Western civilization human being eats on average. And that's quite a lot. Now, most of that will just come out the other end, but just as with the animals it came from, some of it will go into our bloodstream and it will stay in our body doing, we don't know exactly what harm. Some people think the most similar thing will be what happened to us when we breathed in asbestos, which means that a cancer will form on average 30 years later. And for those of you who are middle-aged, that will not really affect your average lifetime. But for those who feel responsible for our children or have children of your own, this is a really serious problem. What can we do about it? We need to start pushing for biodegradable plastic. We need to use other materials than plastic when we can. And we need to eat and drink as clean as possible and vote for politicians that take this seriously.